In the early 1800s, as Europe marched towards science and enlightenment, a darker experiment was unfolding in the heart of Italy, one that blurred the lines between discovery and damnation. Giovanni Aldini was hailed as a pioneer, the nephew of Luigi Galvani, the man who first discovered that electricity could make a dead frog's leg twitch. But Aldini took his uncle's work further, much further. Where Galvani saw reaction, Aldini saw resurrection. Where others saw nerves, he saw the soul. And while his peers debated ethics in candlelit salons, Aldini stepped into the dungeons, in the basements of hospitals and the catacombs beneath Bologna and Milan. Aldini began testing his theories, not on frogs or dogs or cadavers, but on people, not just any people, condemned criminals. His reasoning was simple. If a person was already sentenced to die, why waste their body? Why not see what science could reveal in those final moments? But what history rarely discusses, what was left out of the medical journals, was what happened before the wires were connected, before the electric spark. Some of these criminals, it turns out, were not dead yet. They were alive, and placed into iron coffins. It began with rumors, letters from executioners to city officials, hushed whispers in prison corridors, men sentenced not to a clean hanging or a quick bullet, but to something darker, something experimental. The iron coffin was a device designed not by engineers, but by physicians. Heavy, solid, airtight, with only narrow breathing slits carved at the top. Not enough for escape, just enough to scream through. The subject would be stripped, shackled, and slid into the coffin, sometimes with iron tongs, sometimes forcefully with kicks and rods. Once inside, the lid was bolted down. They were then carried, sometimes by a horse-drawn cart, to a secluded burial ground on the outskirts of the city. There, under Aldini's orders, the coffin was lowered into a shallow pit, and then he buried. The dirt wasn't packed tightly. After all, Aldini still needed access. The subject had to be retrieved. Later, sometimes dead, sometimes barely breathing, depending on what the experiment demanded. But the time inside the coffin, that was the real punishment. It was silent. It was dark. It was unbearably hot, especially in the Italian summer, when the metal would trap heat like an oven. Inside, the subject would sweat, suffocate, hallucinate. Their screams would echo back into their ears. Their breath would thicken. Some would vomit and, drown in it, some would scratch the walls until their fingernails peeled off. A few were said to chew through their own tongues, not out of madness, but desperation, hoping to choke themselves and end it. And the worst part, there was no clock, no voice, no signal, just dirt, weight, and time. For the condemned, it wasn't just a burial, it was a living death. According to Aldini's surviving notes, some of which are housed in private libraries in Florence, at least 9 individuals were subjected to this punishment between 1802 and 1806. One entry reads, "Subject responded with uncontrollable tremors, no pulse. Upon exhumation, left hand was found clenched tightly around tongue. Severe bruising around neck, likely self-inflicted. Facial expression suggested persistent terror to the final breath." This wasn't medical science. This was torment in the name of progress. But why? Why bury them alive before electrocuting them? Aldini believed that heightened terror pushed the soul closer to the edge, that when a person had experienced the brink of death, their body became primed for electrical response. His experiments showed that a heart, when restarted with galvanic current, beat stronger if the subject had just been tortured. He wanted to prove that electricity could resurrect the body, and maybe, in time, the consciousness. So the coffin wasn't just punishment, it was preparation. The most infamous of these cases was that of Luca Moretti, a thief from Modena sentenced to death for repeated burglary and suspected political pamphleteering, a dangerous act in Napoleonic Italy. Instead of hanging, Moretti was selected as Aldini's subject. His family begged for a clean execution. The magistrate agreed publicly, but behind closed doors, Aldini had already arranged the iron casket. Moretti was dragged from his cell before dawn, screaming and resisting. Witnesses said the sounds from the basement, where the coffin was kept, were like a man being torn apart by invisible blades. Once inside, the casket was sealed and buried. He remained underground for over 7 hours. When the coffin was exhumed, Aldini recorded that Moretti was foaming, eyes bulged, skin flayed at wrist from restrained struggle. No signs of coherent speech, pupils dilated upon stimulation. His body convulsed as if summoned by life itself. In other words, the perfect subject. He was then placed on a metal slab and wired. Electricity surged through his corpse. His arms lifted, his back arched, his face twisted into something halfway between pain and expression. To the crowd of students and aristocrats watching, it looked like resurrection. But there was no soul behind the eyes, just a husk reacting to power. Moretti never spoke again. His body was dissected, his brain stored in formaldehyde and later lost during a flood. But Aldini's reputation? It soared. He was invited to perform in London, Paris, and Vienna. Newspapers hailed him as the master of Death's curtain. But behind the applause were graveyards of unnamed men, all buried, baked, and broken inside iron coffins. And Aldini never once stood trial. He died comfortably in Milan in 1834, never punished, never condemned. Because what he did wasn't considered torture. It was science, or so the world told itself. But in the shadows of medical progress, those who screamed into steel and suffocated in silence knew better. They weren't subjects, they were sacrifices. And that sacrifice, buried beneath textbooks and surgical glory, is what Torture's Room is here to remember. Not all subjects went quietly. In 1805, Aldini acquired two prisoners from the port city of Genoa. One of them, Sebastiano Rocca, was a known smuggler and alleged killer. The other, Tommaso Bellini, was convicted of printing anti-regime leaflets. A political dissident in a time when silence was survival. Aldini arranged for both men to be delivered to a rural facility outside Bologna. What was recorded next didn't appear in official publications. It appeared only in a letter discovered years later in a private collection, written by an anonymous assistant. They were both to be placed into the coffins at the same time. Rocca cursed and spat until the bolt shut him in. Bellini cried out for God until the lid closed. We buried them in adjacent pits, spaced just far enough apart that they could not hear each other. But I wonder, in the hours they spent screaming, did they imagine the other still living or already dead? The day was unusually hot. The iron coffins absorbed heat quickly. The soil, already dry, became dense and heavy. After 6 hours, Rocca's coffin was unsealed, according to Aldini's report. He was unconscious but breathing, his chest heaving like a trapped animal. His skin was blistered, lips blue, and pupils barely reactive. Bellini's coffin wasn't opened until over 9 hours later. What they found was described in chilling clinical terms: severe ocular hemorrhaging, self-inflicted bite wounds on both arms, excreta pulled in corner. Subject expired approximately 30 minutes. Before retrieval, Bellini had died in the dark, completely alone, not from trauma, but from fear, panic, and asphyxiation. Aldini performed galvanic stimulation on both bodies in front of the local governor and several invited intellectuals. Rocca's corpse twitched violently, his limbs reacting in near-human fashion. Bellini's body barely moved. The audience was less impressed, but Aldini didn't care. He wasn't entertaining. He was proving something. Over time, the iron coffin executions became known among Italy's criminal underworld. Whispers of the metal box of no return spread from jail to jail. In some cases, prisoners begged for hanging. Instead, some attempted suicide before sentencing. Some vanished, disappeared by nervous jailers who feared becoming accessories. And yet, Aldini continued, because his reputation was no longer confined to Italy. In 1806, Aldini traveled to France, where he hoped to gain access to prisoners from Napoleon's army. But in Paris, he was blocked. Officials called his methods barbaric, though not for the tortures themselves. They were upset that his results were inconclusive, so Aldini returned to Bologna and doubled down. That winter, a series of mysterious disappearances were reported near the outskirts of the city. Peasants claimed to hear moaning beneath the soil late at night. Others swore they saw men in dark coats carrying boxes into shallow fields and returning without them. One farmer uncovered a partially buried coffin with scratch marks along the inside. No body, just blood. City officials dismissed the claims as superstition. Aldini never responded to the rumors. In 1807, he received funding from the Austrian court, who hoped his work could lead to breakthroughs in battlefield resuscitation. But he never returned to the front lines. Instead, he continued working in secret, less science, more ritual. By 1810, his assistants reported disturbing changes. Aldini began performing experiments alone. Often at night, he spoke of bridging the gap between death and memory. He believed the final thoughts of the dying could be trapped, like electricity, and read through galvanic replay. He theorized that fear was not just an emotion. It was an energy, one that imprinted itself on the nervous system in the final seconds before death. The more terrifying the death, the stronger the imprint. And so, the iron coffin wasn't just a method of punishment. It was a recording device, in Aldini's twisted vision. He believed he could pull back the dying man's final emotion through precise electrical stimulation. That, if done right, the corpse would twitch not randomly, but intentionally. To Aldini, this was communication. The dead speaking their final words, not through sound, but through convulsion. By 1812, most of his colleagues had abandoned him. Even admirers like Alexander von Humboldt distanced themselves from his work. But Aldini didn't care. He wasn't chasing applause. He was chasing eternity. One final case, perhaps the most disturbing of all, occurred in 1813. The subject's name was never recorded, only the initials, E.M. described as male, mid-30s, likely a deserter or political criminal, according to Aldini's private notes. Subject E.M. was placed in coffin with additional lining, a copper plate beneath the spine. Intention was to amplify galvanic feedback. Burial lasted 11 hours. Upon recovery, subject was unresponsive but intact. Stimulation caused rhythmic, symmetrical limb movement, not previously observed. Head tilted toward observers, jaw opened. Slightly the sound emerged, unidentifiable. That sound. Some believe it was a vocal cord spasm. Others believe it was intentional. The assistant who recorded the event resigned the next day, reportedly telling a colleague, "The dead man turned toward me. His body should not have moved like that." Something he was looking back. After that, Aldini's experiments slowed. He published a few final papers and retreated from public view. He died quietly in 1834. His estate sold off and papers scattered. But in the archives of his final will, one line stood out: "Let the box remain sealed." The voice is still within. What box? No one knows. But some believe one of Aldini's original iron coffins still exists, hidden in the earth, sealed for over 200 years, with something inside. Not just a body, but a memory. And Torture's Room is here to make sure the memory never stays buried. By the time Giovanni Aldini died, the world had already begun to forget the names of those he buried. No monuments were built for them, no gravestones, no proper records. Most of their bodies were dissected, tossed, or simply lost to the soil that had suffocated them. Their stories were replaced with tales of progress, of electricity's future, of medicine's triumph over mystery. But the truth still lingers in whispers. In 1854, a group of workers digging a sewer line in northern Bologna unearthed a rusted metal box, roughly the size of a man, when pried open. They found nothing inside but a pair of heavy restraints bolted to the floor, a copper plate fused to the bottom, and long, deep claw marks scored into the interior. The box was discarded. The discovery never made the papers. But among historians of dark medicine and torture, it matched every detail of Aldini's iron coffins. In the decades following Aldini's death, galvanism evolved into legitimate science. It laid the foundation for defibrillation, nerve mapping, even early neurology. But none of those fields acknowledge the cruel road taken to get there. They don't talk about the living burials. They don't mention the coffins designed not to kill, but to torment. They don't list the names of the tortured, because most of them had no names worth recording. Criminals, runaways, the poor, the heretical, the silent, their deaths were considered useful in many ways. That was the worst part, not the darkness, not the suffocation, not the slow decay of oxygen and the panic, but the knowledge that no one would stop it, that even if they screamed through those narrow slits, no one was listening, and no one cared, because the man doing it was respected. He had funding, papers, support, and because of that, the iron coffin was never labeled torture. It was called research. And what about the ones who survived? Some did. A few subjects were recovered alive and pardoned by the courts as a reward for their contribution to science, but they didn't go on to live normal lives. One man, believed to be a survivor from an 1809 burial, was found wandering a Milan alley months later, naked, muttering, refusing to enter buildings. He would claw at any door that closed behind him. Eventually, he starved to death in the open air. The local authorities buried him without a name. Another, identified only as Marco, reportedly lived in a monastery for the rest of his life. He never spoke, never left the walls, and kept a single candle burning in his cell at all hours, unable to sleep in darkness again. The damage wasn't just physical, it was existential. To be buried alive, to feel the weight of earth above you, to hear your own breath collapse into panic, was to have your sense of time, place, and identity shattered. Aldini called it preparation, but what he prepared was fear, refined, sharpened, measured, and then forgotten, until now. Because torture's room doesn't look away from what history wants to bury. We bring it back, we open the coffins, we speak the names that were erased, and we remember not just the cruelty, but the excuses that made it possible. The way horror can hide behind progress. The way screams can be silenced not by force, but by paperwork. So when you hear the name Giovanni Aldini in a textbook, when you read about his galvanic experiments and scientific contributions, remember the box. Remember the men who were placed inside. Remember the ones who begged for death and were denied it until the experiment was ready. Because science may have moved on, but their fear never left the ground.